Okay, everybody, we're going to get started. Thank you so much for joining our session. I have a treat for you today. It's fascinating stuff.
And we must add, this conversation is not an endorsement of the use or experimentation with illegal drugs for medical purposes. How is your ability to write and talk about this not just swamped by all of that history you write about?
Well, I like everybody else, my image of LSD and psilocybin was that 60s image of drugs that were being used as party drugs very carelessly, kids taking them to go to concerts and things like that. I had no idea that long before that, as your clip showed, they were a very serious subject of, they were thought of as psychiatric wonder drugs. And when they escaped the lab and were embraced by the counterculture is when you got this backlash. And we're still kind of getting over that backlash, but it seems to be happening because the research has been so compelling so far. It's not, we haven't completed the process of figuring out what they're good for.
Well, now, let's be very specific here. We're not talking about drugs. Mm-hmm. We're talking about indigenous compounds found by eating a plant, a fungus, or drinking a vine from the rainforest. I mean, we're not talking about some kid cooking up something in his kitchen. Right. That I'm not interested in, because of shamans that live in the rainforest who have been working with these indigenous brews since as far back as they have recorded history. And if you ask them, even they don't know what the origins are. Right. How did they find a vine and a leaf and brew it exactly the amount of time that it took to create ayahuasca?
If you look at use of other drugs, more or less across the board, whether it's alcohol or hard drugs and maybe cannabis as well, you'll see a negative relationship there. The more you take of those drugs, the worse your mental health, higher rates of suicidality. That trend is bucked by psychedelics. It goes in the other direction.
Interesting. So no holes in your brain, nothing like that.
No.
You can't die from an overdose or something?
Well, physiologically, it's very safe. I mean, if you were to die, it would be through some accident where you've got yourself in trouble playing in traffic or something like that, which is why people should respect these compounds.
Now, then you get to this place where you say, well, people who experiment with psychedelics, people who talk about psychedelics are sort of sanctioned into the world of the crazy, into the world of the lunatic, into the world of the nomad, the past the pale, outside of culture, sort of the shamanic journey sort of thing. And we're not there anymore. What's happening now is that the world of the psychedelic, the world that is just on the edge of our perception, is starting to be cracked open. We're starting to crack that world open. And whether we're talking about, kids in Silicon Valley that are microdosing, or whether we're talking about the hardcore granddaddies of psychedelics who are like blasting their minds out into outer space. Either way, even on the microdosing level, you're still accessing some primal information that has ridden in our DNA, ridden along inside of our DNA this whole time, since the very beginning of time. And this goes to what you and I talked about, that there are times in your life as a philosopher, and there are times in your life as a scientist and as a technologist, that you look so deeply that you realize you're looking in, that you're not just looking outward, you end up looking into the self. So psychedelics and psilocybin, DMT, ayahuasca, all of these things widen your perspective of awareness. You start to see things that are here, but invisible to the cultural eye, is the way to say it, really.
But when the drugs left the labs and started hitting the streets, and Timothy Leary preached,
"Turn on, tune in, and drop out,"
the bad trips and even worse headlines that followed changed their reputation. And then,
this nation faces a major crisis in terms of the increasing use of drugs, particularly among our young people.
the Controlled Substance Act led to a more than 3 decades-long ban on all psychedelic research. Since 2003, however, the FDA has allowed for a few clinical trials of illegal hallucinogens, drugs like psilocybin, the psychedelic ingredient found in so-called magic mushrooms.
I mean, they are scary, and I think that's useful that people are scared of these drugs, because they should be, in a sense, they should respect them. They're not party drugs, they're not things that you can take so freely like alcohol, or at least as people do. And so context is essential.
What do you say, Steve, to the naysayers, parents who think you're just advocating drugs, people who don't understand, one, what it was like, the condition you had, and two, how you're taking this drug and how you're using it in your life? Can you help people sort of get an understanding of that?
Sure. I think it's a complex situation because our drug laws aren't really science-based. Our laws have been drafted on the social values at the time they were created. And since then, a lot of science has been conducted, looking at the safety and safe ways to use some of these drugs as medicines. And we really have a lot of evidence now to say that, for example, the classic psychedelics are actually far, far safer than alcohol and tobacco. And what Stephen Bryant and I are proposing is that they are made available as prescription medicines and administered by trained medical and health professionals. We're not proposing, that they be made available to the general public uncontrolled at all.
So what does psychedelic mean? Well, it means mind revealing, mind manifesting, making the mind, or more accurately actually the soul, psyche, visible. And that principal property is really at the core, I would argue, of why these compounds are interesting.
And what does a trip even feel like?
Well, it feels very strange. Some people say it can be up there with the most strangest experiences of their lives. They can liken it to, it's been likened to the near-death experience in terms of intensity. So pretty much about the extreme that it's possible for a human to experience in terms of an altered state of consciousness.
And I had this incredible experience it was a fairly high dose experience, of my ego or sense of self absolutely dissolving.
And I think my experiences with ayahuasca and my experiences with psilocybin, personally, my experience of that has been to see the geometric world that exists just underneath our reality. And for example, when I went to Peru and worked with ayahuasca, all 3 times, I was in a world, because you sort of float in and out of what we call reality when you're...
There's reality and that reality.
Exactly. So there are periods where you are aware of the reality that is around us, and then there's this sub-reality that's geometric, that has no reference to the physical world that we know and that we understand. Mm-hmm. And the way I described it, it was sort of facets of shapes and colors. What we see around us is only a very, very tiny micro sliver of what reality really is. Think about microwaves, think about radiation, think about Wi-Fi, the things that are around us all the time that we cannot see. Doesn't mean it's not real, it means that we don't have the brains to see it yet.
There's something that, for me, makes sense
about DMT. You called it the spirit molecule. It might almost be called, the reality molecule. Philosophically, it makes sense that something that would be so fundamental to the way we perceive reality would be imbued out there in reality.
There was a sense around it that there was something special, that it wasn't like anything else. There wasn't like other psychedelics. Its intensity and speed was such that it really produced a different kind of response. I mean, I remember almost getting the sense that it was kind of like a psychedelic bungee jump.
And I realized at a certain point when I was on sort of in the middle, I think it was the first night of working with ayahuasca, that I realized that what I was looking at, because for a minute I was trying to understand what I was seeing structurally, because when you're having these experiences, the first thing you want to do is trying to understand your environment, understand what you're seeing, and have some sort of context and some sort of coherent symbolism based around it. So when you see it, you're trying to give a reference. You're trying to say, oh, that's a pyramid, or oh, that's a tree, or whatever it is that you're seeing. And what I was seeing was this multifaceted geometric shape that kept morphing. And it took me a minute, but eventually I realized, oh, I'm actually seeing the structure of consciousness. I'm actually seeing the geometric structure of consciousness. And that it's continually shifting, that it's continually evolving, and that that realm of the psychedelic enables us to see geometric shapes, geometric concepts in a way that we don't see in our sort of everyday waking life.
Right. Once these drugs became abused and scandalized, psychiatry had to really work hard, to distance themselves from any valid scientifically meritorious relationship with psychedelics. Being a psychiatrist and saying you want to learn or study about psychedelics, it's not that well received. And I made one mention one time and was discouraged from really bringing it up again for actually a number of years.
For cultural reasons, the whole class of compounds got pulled off the clinical bench, and no research has gone on for 40 years. So scientifically, I can't imagine a more exciting area to be pursuing.
How does one go about studying these plants and compounds? Plants and compounds which produce unimaginable experiences and appear to shed light on some of humanity's greatest mysteries.
Well, now we're getting into the culturally sanctioned part of this, which is now the billionaires are our shamans, right? Which is, and as depressing as that is, it's as if the seas part when Elon Musk says something because he's got billions of dollars, or when Bezos says something, the seas part, and people think, oh, but it's we live especially in the Western culture, we live in a culture based on transactional psychology and transactional philosophy. And so you're right, the modern shaman for the Western culture is the billionaire, and people take what they say, and it's like religion. They believe what they say, and it's because everyone is obsessed with the material world now. Yeah.
You said this is not mysticism, but I would say
it is mystical. I understand.
Right? No, it is mysticism. It's just we have to re-understand what mysticism was.
We have, from the age of the primates, we have been aware unconsciously, collectively, that there is a geometric humming of consciousness, the voice of the cosmos that has been just under the surface of our perception. It's in nature, so nature is a constant reminder of the code. I mean, it's everywhere. Patterns in weather, structures in plants. I mean, it's the structures of beehives, the hive mind mentality, that all of those are a part of the conversation of the geometric nature of reality. And when you experiment with LSD, when you experiment with psilocybin, when you experiment with ayahuasca and DMT, it is giving you it's giving you a direct portal into the world of the geometric, the micro and the macro of the geometric.
DMT is somehow, it seems to me in my experience, more of a breakthrough than LSD, mushrooms, peyote, and so on. And it is in itself more of a mystery. How could this little stuff produce something that has intelligence, that is actually a doorway to another reality?
Now, something else this weekend that I found interesting that Terence talked about was this idea that when you're in the world of the psychedelic experience, you are often met by something that feels like an entity. But there is something that is here with us and has been here with us from the very beginning. And really, I mean, listen, the theme of the digital mushroom has been thrown around a lot by a lot of people, but there's no way to describe that except to use that phrase, that when you are consuming information from a computer, you are literally biting into a digital mushroom. That is, you're having a psychedelic experience when you're doing what we're doing right now. The people that are watching this right now, that is a hallucination. I'm not in the room with you.
Right, that is.
Think about it. I'm not in the room with you.
Telepathy.
It is telepathy. It is the telepathy of the digital space.
Talking through vast amounts of space and time, and it's still
wherever you are. I mean, yes, on a flat screen, you're getting the perception, the connection.
By rearranging electrons to our
it's basically a psychedelic electron experience.
Yeah.
For you to be sitting in your room and you to be seeing what's happening right now. This person is talking to you. And just think about this too. I mean, that in itself is miraculous. And I keep bringing people back to the base of that reality, because people tend to sort of jump way over that idea into let's create AI, let's create.
Right.
But we have to have an understanding of what this is. We have to have an understanding, a deep psychological understanding of, and philosophical understanding of what is technology. Where did it come from? Is it us? Is it nature?
And a sort of remarkable mirror of the mind.
The curiosity, perhaps the uniqueness of the human creature, is that we live in both realms. We have the ability for spiritual experience, and we have the ability for physical experience.
If you look at use of other drugs, more or less across the board, whether it's alcohol or hard drugs and maybe cannabis as well, you'll see a negative relationship there. The more you take of those drugs, the worse your mental health, higher rates of suicidality. That trend is bucked by psychedelics. It goes in the other direction.
Interesting. So no holes in your brain, nothing like that.
No.
You can't die from an overdose or something.
Well, physiologically, it's very safe. I mean, if you were to die, it would be through some accident where you've got yourself in trouble playing in traffic or something like that. Which is why people should respect these compounds. I don't necessarily want to, promote use of psychedelics, because there are such important caveats, such as people taking them in the right context, the importance of the preparatory work and the integration work. And so the worries, the concerns are over people doing this irresponsibly, recklessly, as they often do, music festivals, this kind of thing, or they have a psychiatric vulnerability. around psychosis, and they have some kind of psychotic break. Very rare, it seems, looking at the data, but it does happen. We do have to take it seriously. In our modern research, we screen very carefully for vulnerabilities for psychosis.
Camilo and I were talking about this before we went live. What I find interesting is that a lot of psychedelic experts end up talking about technology. They end up talking about the future of technology. They end up talking about how technology changes who and what we are. Terence ended up doing that. Timothy Leary, same thing. And you see it a lot with people who go down into the psychedelic realm. They come back with this sort of goodie bag filled with knowledge that ends up creating these gadgets and devices that we end up using and that we're using right now. I mean, what we're doing right now is influenced by someone, Steve Jobs,
right?
Who, because I'm on a Mac right now. So Steve Jobs was a huge believer in LSD. He used it to see the world in a very different way. And so today, I really want to talk about the effect that microdosing is having, because microdosing has become so popular, specifically in Silicon Valley, but it's actually becoming popular in research studies, psychological research studies. And people are beginning to understand that the reality that we've been sold, this idea of what Terence is saying, linguistically reinforced hallucination, that culture is continually telling us that this is reality, this thing that we've created around us is reality, when in fact, it's what we see around us is only a very, very tiny micro sliver of what reality really is.